Hello, and welcome to Pennsylvania in Focus. I'm Eliana Kernodle, Assistant General Manager for America's Talking Network, standing in for Kristen Smith this week. Joining me, as always, is Anthony Hennon, Pennsylvania reporter for the Center Square. How are you, Anthony?
I'm good. How are you doing?
Doing pretty well. Enjoying the holidays.
Good.
At thecentersquare.com, you wrote a year in review on the progress and ongoing problems in the EMS system in Pennsylvania. The state made progress on reimbursement rates, but continues to face some problems with staffing shortages, funding, and legal issues. Let's start with reimbursement rates. What progress did Pennsylvania make on this in 2023?
Yeah, so this has been a longstanding sticking point, like we've seen with a lot of different EMS issues in the Commonwealth here. In October, we finally saw Act 15 was signed into law, which now requires Medicaid to reimburse EMS agencies for every ambulance mile traveled with a patient. This was a big deal because before this law, agencies wouldn't get any reimbursement until they traveled at least 20 miles with a patient in the ambulance. So this has been a longstanding problem on the financial side for a lot of these EMS agencies because generally they couldn't even break even on a lot of these ambulance runs. They would be, at best, they would be trying to hit costs, but generally they were looking at, on average statewide, they'd lose something like, I believe, $150 for each ambulance run. So that's been a longstanding problem of just trying to make these things financially solvent, not even trying to get more revenue to fund other aspects of EMS. But after, this has been a years-long back and forth of, we've seen previous bills that knocked it down to maybe after 5 miles rather than 20, but this one that came through, now it's, every mile that you have a patient within the ambulance, you will finally be getting some Medicaid reimbursement. For some of these agencies, that's a huge boost. We've seen a lot of problems across the state of agencies simply closing down or trying to merge with nearby ones, especially in these rural areas. So this has been a big boost for a number of them.
Sounds like it would be. I know funding in general has been a major issue, and hopefully this will be some help with that going forward. And that's played into kind of this next problem that they've continued to face issues with, is having a staffing shortage and running into problems with being able to have enough people to even operate. What has that looked like?
Yeah, so I think what a lot of people in Pennsylvania might not realize is that legally, EMS agencies are required to provide services, but townships, localities, municipalities are not legally required to fund those services. So this has been a strain in a lot of different branches financially, but we've seen through staffing shortages and labor problem where this really comes out. Because without more funding, a lot of these wages are relatively low. There's different county leaders warned in February of a system collapse due to problems stemming from the pandemic. They've also noted that it's hard to actually recruit and keep people because when you look at places like even Sheetz, McDonald's, some jobs that we kind of see as these basic retail jobs, they're offering comparable wages, but with much less stress on someone. Some agencies we've seen, they've argued that they can't actually guarantee quick responses to 911 calls simply because they have a problem retaining workers, having a problem making sure that they have full staff so they can rotate people in and out and be able to respond quickly. When especially we're looking in rural Pennsylvania, some of these counties, if you only have one ambulance outfit, they could be 45 minutes away from their next call. So labor shortages have been a long-running issue. And we kind of see that spill out in a number of ways, unfortunately.
And you talked some about how in the past, in emergency services of different kinds, volunteerism and different ways of fundraising have been able to help kind of bridge the gap when there's shortages. But that's not necessarily enough anymore. Can you tell us more about that?
Yeah, so I think this also kind of gives some broader context to why Pennsylvania is having these problems. Part of this is Pennsylvania never necessarily needed to require municipalities to pay for a lot of these services because we've had a long history of volunteerism where, you had a ton of volunteer firefighters, of volunteer paramedics and EMS staff. And, that is not really the case anymore. We've seen population either stagnate statewide or shrink, especially in these rural areas. And as we've moved away from a manufacturing economic base where you had people on, third shift, et cetera, they could easily volunteer to staff this, be the local fire station, the local EMS service. That doesn't really happen anymore, or it still happens, just nowhere near the extent that it would 40, 50 years ago. So we've heard from a number of different EMS agencies that they can't simply barbecue their way to a new fire truck, as one of them put it earlier this summer. And so, this extends to a labor shortage, but this also extends to financial problems. 40, 50 years ago, fire trucks were not necessarily as expensive as they are now. And, where you would see, local communities putting on ice cream socials or spaghetti dinners, barbecue dinners. In a lot of ways, for these larger capital needs, for new equipment purchases, that could really take care of a lot of these problems, but not so anymore. And especially when you see some of the rising costs of some of this protective equipment, where it's simply, we didn't have this sort of equipment 20 years ago. And so now it's much harder to, I guess, run an EMS agency or a firefighting service on a shoestring budget like we used to.
Yeah, and a lot of those new technology, they're great and very helpful at helping save lives and really helping those people do their jobs. But because they're so specialized, it can be extremely expensive.
Yes, exactly.
Well, in addition to these, which have kind of grown into a long-standing problem, what other perennial problems have the EMS system continued to face?
Yeah, I think we touched on it a bit, but I think the issue of shoring up EMS funding, of making sure that municipalities, if you're receiving this coverage, it seems an issue of fairness that you should also be paying for this coverage. Because when they don't, if you have one township that's paying for these services to keep them going and another that doesn't, not only are you straining the agency, but you're also weakening the social safety net in general for these things. And this is not something that has come out of nowhere. This has been building for years, for decades, and we haven't really seen a statewide solution to this. So this is something where when you talk with EMS officials, they say this is a problem that local and state leaders have kind of kicked the can down the road on, and no one's really taken charge of trying to find a broader fix here. There's also complaints from EMS leaders that the state EMS bureau is more of an antagonizer than serving as a coordinator or someone to help these local agencies. From things of just adding more stress and different fights to unnecessary paperwork or a lack of spending guidelines that can be very vague and liable to abuse, has also been an issue for some of these agencies of either not knowing what they need to keep track of to make sure that everything is, fine on a legal front, making sure that they know what you can and can't do with this money. There's a lot of arguments that the state can do more to bolster these local agencies, these local crews that have been doing this for years, if not decades, but not necessarily having an easy or clear or simple fix.
Well, we're almost out of time, but looking ahead into the new year, it's just around the corner. Are you anticipating any developments on these issues?
So I think, this upcoming year, we're probably still going to see fights over different reimbursement rates. That seems to be a perennial thing and something that a lot of advocates feel you have to fight, 5 or 10 years for before you get any change. And then you're kind of back to needing another increase, especially as we've seen, inflation effects driving things up, increased competition for pulling people in. I think definitely staffing issues will continue to be a thing. Even in recent weeks, we've seen new announcements of EMS closures or EMS mergers, so I expect to see more of that. If you look at places like Erie County, there's debates around doing countywide EMS authority, which we've seen that down in suburban Pittsburgh as well as a solution, and I believe in suburban Philadelphia. So I would keep my eyes out for things like consolidation or some countywide efforts. I think in general, just that fundamental issue of how do you attract more people, especially in a tight labor market, and what is the role of municipalities, of should townships be offering certain funding amounts, or should the state offer townships the ability to levy a tax for EMS agencies, which we've seen some action in the state house over that, but we have not actually seen a bill get out of committee for it. That's what we're looking at for 2024.
Well, thank you for your insights on this story. We are out of time. Listeners can keep up with this story and more at thecentersquare.com. For Anthony Hennon, I'm Eliana Kernodle. Please subscribe and thank you for listening.
Are you tired of news that puts politics over people? At the nonprofit Franklin News Foundation, we believe in putting people over politics by delivering nonpartisan news and audio content that serves you, the American taxpayer. With Franklin News Foundation, you can read fact-based, state-focused news for free at thecentersquare.com. You can listen to civil, balanced conversations between policy experts through our podcast network at americastalking.com. Or you can get in-depth news on K-12 education spending, curriculum, and school safety at chalkboardnews.com. It's all free through Franklin, where we put you, the American taxpayer, first in every story, episode, and conversation. And it's only possible through our supporters. Together, we can produce content that puts people over politics and brings Americans the news they deserve. Become a supporter today at franklinnews.org/donate. Once again, that's franklinnews.org/donate.